Still with us for this portion of the show, Emira Woods is an Associate Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies and board member of ActionAid. And from Nairobi, Adebayo Alonge is a Nigerian public policy analyst and blogger. Adebayo, thanks for joining us. Emira, thanks for staying with us. Adebayo, let me start with you. Nigeria is facing a food crisis of its own. We've just been talking about the food crisis in South Sudan. But in Nigeria, aid agencies say up to 11 million people in northeastern Nigeria will not have enough to eat. 120,000 of them face famine-like conditions. And Al Jazeera reports that 400,000 children are at risk of famine in northeastern Nigeria. What can you tell us about what's going on there?
Yes, the situation arises as a result of the immediate cause of the Boko Haram crisis. So as the world is aware, over the last few years, the northeast of Nigeria has faced a terrorist crisis that has prevented farmers from being able to make their own food. And as a result of the displacement, many of them actually are very much dependent on the government and aid agencies for food. What has happened is that we don't really have much accountability in how all the donor funds as well as the food that's being distributed that is supposed to get to these displaced people is being used. So that is actually the critical reason why we actually see a lot of people in the region today facing starvation.
So, Emira, here we have a country like Nigeria, a huge country, biggest population in Africa. The country's agriculture minister, who's also the minister in charge of rural development, says the country is not facing a famine, that this is regional. The food shortages are regional. In fact, he says the country is an exporter of food. It's a bread basket. So how does something like this happen in a country like that?
Well, that's the irony, because Nigeria, 140 million people, certainly has the ability to grow enough food to feed its people. But what is happening? We have, again, the climate change going on, and that's impacting this region. So there is a downturn in agricultural production, right, in spite of the fact that Nigeria has been an exporter of food. This year, there is, and the last 2 years, actually, there's been a drop in agricultural production because of the environmental conditions, right? The climate change that's happening throughout the region. But in addition to that, what you have in Nigeria is an economic crisis where the currency, the naira, has been devalued. So the price of food has gone up for those in urban cities particularly. They're unable to
right,
actually pay to put food on the table. So that the rising costs have been tremendous for those who are unable to grow their own food. And now we have, because of the crisis, because of the tensions in the north in particular, you have people unable to farm, unable to actually be in their homes because of security concerns. And so those displaced peoples are actually in need of food that they have to now buy. So the escalating prices, the devaluation of the naira, the environmental conditions as they are having such a dampening effect on agricultural production, all of this is making the situation dire. And it looks like it will continue to be dire for the coming months.
Right, and add to that, as you pointed out, the conflict taking place in the region, and you've got the perfect storm here.
Without a doubt, the perfect storm where people are caught without the ability to put food on the table, without the security that they need to be on their farms, to grow their food. And you have also tensions that are not just the Boko Haram tensions. These are traditional tensions of herders and farmers that have gone on for generations, and yet you see it escalating with the pressures because of climate change on this region.
Adebayo, the crisis that we see in northeastern Nigeria is not just confined to that part of the country. In fact, the head of the World Food Programme says conditions in the entire Lake Chad region is facing a famine. Let's listen to what she had to say.
We need to ensure that we raise the profile of the challenges that are being faced by the 4.4 million people here who are food insecure and 1.8 million who are severely food insecure. Our funds will run out in mid-March. And what we're hopeful is that it won't take babies beginning to die before the world pays attention.
So there we heard it, Adebayo. Funds will run out in mid-March. That's next week. What happens then?
Well, the Nigerian government recently reached out and set up a task force, and the idea being that it was supposed to sort of go around, do a fact-finding mission, determine exactly what was going on, not just in the northeast region, but also in all the states bordering on the Sahel, and find out exactly what's going on in terms of food supply. There have also been discussions in the government about reaching out into the grain reserves, but I think by mid-March, I think what we really need to do, not just in Nigeria, but across the region, is actually to declare this as a global emergency, particularly affecting vulnerable people in the region. For a very long time, I think for far too long, the international organizations that are supposed to have raised the level of emergency of this situation have kept it under wraps. And the Nigerian government too has not responded as urgently as it should have over the last few months that aid agencies have actually been calling out and complaining about what's going on in the region. So what is important now at this time, right now immediately, is actually to declare an emergency in the region and begin to raise the funding as well as the food donations that are required to stave off this looming crisis.
Emira, the terrorist group, Boko Haram, they've been very active in this region. What do we know about the security situation right now?
Well, I think you have a tremendous problem in terms of the security, not only from Boko Haram, but also, quite frankly, from the Nigerian military. You have Amnesty International and others that are pointing to the human rights, the very severe human rights violations going on both sides. So there is a crisis of security that has to be dealt with really at its root through a negotiated settlement, right? But in addition to that, you have an economic crisis in Nigeria that is looming large. And so the price of oil falling as it has, the devaluation of the currency, some of the responses of the government, particularly in the case of devaluation of the currency, may not be in the best interest of the country right now, facing this type of a food shortage and an emergency to this scale. So, I think the international community has to sound the alarms, first on the food crisis, but also on the solutions, the long-term solutions to the stability of economies like that of Nigeria, as well as the long-term solutions on issues of climate change that are urgent right now.
Adebayo, what is the United Nations doing about this? We have a humanitarian group like Médecins Sans Frontières, which is telling us that they have appealed to the United Nations, but their calls have been largely ignored.
Yes, I mean, it appears it's stemming from a need to actually protect the reputation of the Nigerian government. This is what I understand has happened and why the United Nations has not raised the situation to being critical. But generally, I think we are actually at that stage where the United Nations really needs to take a stand on the side of the people who are suffering from this crisis and essentially engage with the Nigerian government and get things going to support the people who are suffering in this region. This is the most important thing. We need decisiveness at the most senior levels of the Nigerian government and also decisiveness at the United Nations to save people who are about to die from this crisis.
Emira, we know that, when you look at a crisis like this, a large part of this crisis, of resolving this crisis, is determined by international opinion. This is the crisis that seems to be off the international radar.
Well, I think this is why, the UN is starting to sound the alarm, and why we're grateful, shows like yours that are spotlighting this issue, not only the immediate for this week, but looking at the root causes and looking at the long-term implications. So I think we need more of that because it will take long-range actions, not only responding to the food crisis of this month and this year, but ultimately dealing with issues of climate change that are impacting communities, particularly communities in Africa that are at the epicenter. It will also take economic changes, not, more of the same sort of neoliberal agenda where you devalue the currency, even though there's a crisis going on, right? There has to be outside the box thinking of what African economies need to survive and to put the interests of people first. And I think you have on the continent new groupings of people, Africans Rising, right? As this new network of African civil society, academics, trade unions that are coming together to say we must demand a different path for the continent. And it is those types of initiatives that I think will bring about a longer-term solution to crises like this.
Adebayo, one very quick question on how to resolve this crisis in the right now. Are aid agencies, given that there's violence in the region, are aid agencies able to move around to get aid to the people who need it?
My understanding, given a recent investigative report by the Cable, actually shows that this is not the case. We have a situation where the government agencies that are in charge of this emergency situation are actually covering up their situation actually in the region. So aid agencies that are supposed to be able to reach out to internally displaced people do not really have the kind of access they need on one end. And secondly, the government too doesn't have much transparency into what's going on there.
Okay.
Because so far, the officials who are supposed to represent the government are not giving their proper feedback to the government as to what exactly is going on in the region.
Okay.
So this is the situation.